Hey everybody, welcome back to Tea Time. Dr. T. Today I'm enjoying some rose hips tea, no caffeine. It's very nice and floral, if you will. Um, so today what I wanted to kind of touch base on is the concept of stigma. Um, I'm gonna just kind of hit the surface of stigma because stigma is complex. There's a lot of literature around it, specifically in my area where I talk about stigma, stigmatized identities, concealable stigmatized identities, and that impact that we have specifically on young people. I will kind of get into that in another video, but in this one, I just want to kind of talk about, all right, well, what is stigma? How is it perpetuated? And what kinds are there? And the reason I really wanted to touch base on this is because earlier this week I went to a drug summit, and the idea was that all of these entities were going to come together and really work on solutions. Like, let's unite, let's come together and figure out a way to address what's going on as far as drug use and overdoses and everything else that's happening. And I'm sitting there really excited, ready to take some notes. And I actually think I have my notes here. But you might notice all of these different circles that I have on my notes. And every single one of those circles was a stigmatized term that was used by a speaker. And that was probably within the first 15 minutes. We're talking about the organizations that are funding this summit. Literally in their taglines, the word abuse is there, constantly referencing addicts. It blew my mind that we were told we were coming there to discuss and address and alleviate the symptoms and stigma itself, and yet all that's being used is stigmatizing language. So it made me feel like I really don't know what that means. I am a leader in this state. I'm a governor. I am the runner of this major corporation, and I actually have no idea what stigma means. It's just a buzzword that I'm going to put here so people listen to me. So I'm just going to talk a bit about it, just for the sake of throwing it out there. This is all going to come from literature that I've reviewed. It's also coming from my own personal work, an academic article that's being put together. But I'm thinking a lot of people don't want to read it. They'd rather just hear me kind of break down the basics. But authors like Link, Phelan, Livingston, Boyd, Ahern, Corrigan, Luoma, these are all major stigma academic authors. So stigma, right? What is it? So ultimately stigma kind of encompasses behavior. It is socially constructed. It's actually a social process, and it's perpetuated by non-marginalized groups, okay, to achieve goals of exclusion and conformity. So non-marginalized groups, people in power, use stigma to create this kind of lack of power, lack of voice, lack of ability to really do anything for marginalized groups. Interesting, right? And it's a psychosocial process that marginalized groups actually have to navigate and contend with, right? This is something they deal with all the time, right? It's something they desperately have to consider as they go out into the world, as they talk about who they are, as they interact, right? Am I going to be judged by this certain stigma that I carry? Now, since I was at a drug summit, and of course, most of my work is in substance use, specifically adolescent substance use, we talk about drug use, right? And it's characterized, drug use itself, it's characterized as contrary to the norm, right? And where norm is a social unit that's used to describe a shared belief about how a person should act when they should act that way, right? I need to act a certain way at a certain time. So this is my norm. Shared belief. If we think belief systems, right? Belief systems are based on so many different things. And in belief systems, once we've created them, all we do is figure out and find ways to either support it or find out what doesn't support it, right? It's a binary thing. There is no inclusion, okay, full inclusion when we talk about belief systems. It's inclusion versus exclusion. And so if we think of norms and drug use going against the norm, the shared belief, it's easy to imagine how there became a huge stigma around drug use, okay? Now, if we think of societal norms, right, let's think of the drug phobia. It has existed since the 1930s, right? We're going back a century, okay? The war on drugs, this whole concept was based on drug phobias. Okay, and this is like, if you've let's see, if you haven't read it, read the book Chasing the Scream. Absolutely phenomenal, and it really follows that original fear that kind of turned us into this country that criminalizes substance use, that criminalizes addiction, and we're still doing it. It's not gone, it's just more accepted. Anyway, so this drug phobia, right, is a societal norm. And what we know is societal norms will determine whose lives are worth living and whose lives are not worth living. Right? Think about that. The norms we create in society ultimately determines and says very clearly who we think have lives that are worth living and those who we think don't. And those who we think don't, let's just, lock them up behind some bars. Now, it is really important to point out, it's very poignant to say that the norms that dictate livability can only remain norms if they continue to be acted out and reproduced as social norms. If we were to stop doing that, it would no longer be a social norm, right? Then this anti-norm concept that creates this stigma might go away. Anyway, when we have a phobic culture, so I talk a lot about fear, and it's because so much of our actions and our policies and our procedures are based on fear. But if we think of that concept of a phobic culture, we're looking at a culture of power that's trying to suppress the thing that they fear. And that's ultimately so that marginalized group is denied power. Right? We don't want you to have power because we're afraid of you. Anyway, so there are three interacting levels of stigma. You have societal, you have structural, and you have internalized. Okay, so social stigma, it's also known as public stigma, enacted stigma, and this is group level, okay? And it describes this phenomenon of large social groups endorsing stereotypes about and against stigmatized groups, not against those marginalized groups. So social, right? That as a group, we're social beings. We get social. Structural, right? So the institutional stigma. This is at a systems level. This is very much a lot of what I studied. And of course, if you're interested, you can go read it in my very, very long dissertation. Or I'll maybe just talk about it some other time. Doing lots of presentations coming up on this. So the systems level piece, that structural level, right? It refers to rules, policies, procedures of private and public entities, right? And that are in positions of power, right? We have to consider this power piece. And these rules and policies and procedures, what they do is they actually restrict rights and opportunities of certain groups. So when we talk about criminalizing drugs, we are taking away the rights of individuals who use drugs by making them a criminal. right? I mean, if we think of young people, even if for many places where marijuana is legal, if they get caught with a certain amount at a federal level, it's still illegal. And so they'll lose funding for education. So they already believe, right? I'm not good enough, not great. I'm not doing great in school. This is probably why I'm using in the first place, right? To kind of deal with the fact that I don't really like me. And then we say, well, and then on top of that, we're actually going to take away any chance you have to fund schooling. So, yes, we're reinforcing the fact that you feel like you can't succeed. So, systems, structural level. Okay, internalized. So internalized can be felt stigma or self-stigma. So this, of course, is at the individual level. Okay, so it's a process by which individuals endorse stereotypes, anticipate social rejection, consider stereotypes to be self-relevant, and then believe they are truly devalued members of society. Okay, when they internalize this, they fully believe it, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, well, yeah, I am the scum of society, so I'm just going to navigate and kind of be attracted to what that is because that's who I am. So I might as well go to that social group that I belong with. Now, when we talk about felt stigma, I mean, think of the word, right? Felt, feel. It describes the negative consequences resulting from an individual's awareness of how society perceives this person. And as I said, will likely act toward that group, which they feel they belong. Self-stigma, that's the process of actually accepting society's negative evaluation and then actually incorporating it into a personal value system and sense of self. So if they're taught from very early on that they're a bad person because they use substances, then they're just going to ultimately incorporate that into who they are and their personal value system, right? So this idea of are they created? I mean, you decide. So this internalized stigma is a subjective process. Okay, it's embedded in the socio-cultural context, right? Socio-cultural context. And it's characterized by a lot of things. It's characterized by negative feelings, maladaptive behavior, right? That's why we have treatment centers, rehabs, jail, prison, right? We're treating maladaptive tendencies. Identity transformation, stereotype endorsement, and then that's resulting from these individuals' experiences, perceptions, and the anticipating of those negative social reactions. Now, part of all of this is why I really believe that in my research, what came up is that 12-step programs, right? And this is a piece that I get a lot of backlash for, and that's okay, because anytime you're kind of pushing boundaries, pushing the norm, you're going to get a lot of people that don't like what you have to say. But if we think of a 12-step program, right, there's a lot of reasons that we would consider it beneficial. One, there's that Me Too piece, right? You have someone else who understands what you're going through. You also have access to it wherever you are, right? It's got this great infrastructure where it's just kind of everywhere. It is anonymous, right? Because at this point, substance use and anything around substances is illegal. So you can go in there and you can talk about these things that probably weren't legal and not worry about getting in trouble, right? You have a place to ask for help without that fear of, well, what's going to happen to me, right? This is very often why people don't go into hospitals. They don't walk into a doctor and tell them that they're struggling with substances. They don't walk into a treatment center, right? There is a stigma that goes with just walking into a place like that, right? Because as soon as you walked in, everybody goes, oh, you're an addict. Addict, stigmatized term. Because if we say the term addict, we don't just think human being struggling. We think homeless person under a bridge. So there is a stigmatized view of what that means. And what's fascinating is that term is at the core of 12-step. So stigmatization is embedded in the program. And so if individuals are going in there and stating that I am an addict, I am an alcoholic, they're taking on a stigmatized identity. And then they have to deal with that. And then the anonymity piece, where it is great because it keeps them safe, it teaches them that this is not a part of yourself that society can know about. And so then you really start to struggle, and it becomes a shadow side. And then ultimately, like, it just is a whole nother piece of internalizing a stigma. And so if we're not starting to understand how powerful these words are, we can't expect people to walk in and ask for treatment. There's this, there's a research coming out, right, where we're looking at where legalization of marijuana is causing an increase in, teen drug users. And I genuinely believe the reason we're seeing an increase is because we know about it. When things become legal, people aren't afraid to show you and to tell you. It's when they're illegal that they're going to hide it from you, and we're not going to know that they're there. And so this idea of using a fear-based look at all of these people doing this doesn't make any sense, because we want to know. We want to know what's going on. And the only way that they're going to do that is if they feel safe, is if they feel like they're not going to get in trouble, right? Remember being a child. Remember being a teen. That's what you're concerned about. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to disappoint somebody. So if we think of internalized stigma, the higher the internalized stigma, it's associated with lower levels of hope, empowerment, self-esteem, self-efficacy, right? That belief that I can do something, that belief that I can get past barriers, obstacles, quality of life, and social support. So if anything, try to pay attention to the language that you're using when you're speaking to anyone. This is just so common. It's not like drug use is just like this hidden thing. It's super taboo, right? It affects everybody. So the more openly and honestly we just talk about it using basic terms that maintain the dignity of human life, the more progress we're going to make. And so let's set aside this fear of like, oh no, I'm related to somebody who uses. So what? So are all of us. Anyway, so like I said, I mean, I could talk about this forever, and I could go to town and go on tangents and get really kind of pumped about it, but I'm going to leave it there for today. If you have questions, or if there's something that you just want me to break down even more, because there's a lot here. That was literally just a skimming of the surface of the different types of stigma and kind of the ways we might see it. But just imagine and kind of have this like perspective open up on as you're walking around, looking at billboards, looking at newsletters, hearing people talk. Pay attention to the language that's being used. Is it one full of compassion? Is it one full of understanding? Or is it one full of superiority, inferiority, this need for a binary belief system? And hopefully shift it. Okay, because then we'll actually be able to make some real change. And I look forward to doing that with you. So I hope you have a great day. I hope you enjoyed. Again, let me know if you have any questions. Peace out.